And then we'll be joined in just a few moments. She's getting her wig off. Malia, our leading lady who played Julie Jordan, so she'll be joining us in the panel in just a moment. She'll be able to talk about her perspective on violence in the musical as well. So just a little bit about how we deal with that on stage. Over the last many years, there have been more roles created that that are back behind the table in the rehearsal room, and some of those roles you might not have even noticed you saw the work that they did today. But one of those is our fight choreographer, our fight director, who does all of the physical violence on stage. And then we also have something that's really become necessary, and I think it was always necessary. It just wasn't part of our DNA in the theater and TV and film. It just didn't exist as maybe 10 years ago is when it really started to come into play. And that is an intimacy coordinator or an intimacy director. And that person, what that person does is make sure that some of the, any sort of physical intimacy, any sort of emotional moments in the show, that the actors are supported and they're choreographed as well. Everything from a kiss to a handhold, and any sort of themes that are happening in the show are also talked about with the entire cast. So all of those moments are choreographed so that everyone feels safe, everyone feels comfortable. There are things that people will check in emotionally. So if they had a day that they don't feel comfortable, that's talked about and restaged or choreographed or worked through. If someone's sick on a day where they can't kiss, that's another thing that they have the secondary choreography per se to make that happen as well. So I'd like to talk, first of all, I'd like to talk with Marlene about much of what's presented in the media and art involves drama that's in the extremes of our life experiences. When you see something on stage or in film, on TV, you see the extremes of the Hey, Malia, here's Malia, everyone, our leading lady. So when you see the abuse and violence on TV, films, stage, you see the extremes of that. How does that reflect and reflect in our daily lives, and how it's how it is it the same as what we see on stage and in film?
Thank you. I think most of us up here would probably agree that the media doesn't do a good job of presenting domestic violence. I'm going to put a little plug in. Shalva had our annual event last June, and it was all about the way domestic violence is portrayed in the media. And it projects continues a lot of misconceptions about it, a lot of the myths, and it normalizes domestic violence. I really want to take a second to define what domestic violence is. We use the term domestic violence, domestic abuse, intimate partner abuse, or intimate partner violence. The definition of the word is a pattern of behavior that's used to maintain or gain power and control over an intimate partner. What we see in the media often portrays that as love, as caring, as strength, when in fact, it's really just control over another person. The other problem is that in the media, we see domestic abuse is primarily shown as violence, domestic violence, when it's not always violent. It can be emotional abuse, psychological abuse. It can, in our world, in Shalva, there's spiritual abuse, financial abuse. Even technology is used as a tool to impose power and control over another person. The other point I want to make is that, and this was a point made by the speaker at our event, Jackson Katz, and that is the problem with the language that we hear in the media. The language, particularly in news media, focuses on the victim. It says, how many victims of abuse were there this year? It doesn't focus on the abuser, the perpetrator of that abuse. And I think that ends up victimizing the person. It's the actions of this person, this power and control that we really should be looking at. So in general, I give the media pretty much a failing grade.
And I think just to tag on to that too, some of the conversation around the character of Billy Bigelow, just to bring it back, is his background. We don't really hear much about where he comes from, and I think one of the conversations one of the things we talk about in theater is the moment before, our character development, and what that brings to the picture too. And a moment before is like, let's say, I had to be on stage, but I was backstage in the bathroom and I didn't realize everything had started, or I was getting my wig off and I wanted to rush onto the stage. So that's the moment before. What's that? I guess my question to you is, what is we always hear that that it comes that sometimes it's generation, it comes from generation to generation. What does that look like in your world in particular?
Well, I've got one of our therapists in the audience, so I feel like she would be able to answer that one so much better than I can. But it often does carry through. Children in a home will see how a parent is treated, and it's seen as the behavior that they carry forth into their adulthood. So it's really important that victims, we actually prefer to use the term survivors, because no matter where you are in your healing journey, you're surviving the abuse, that the survivors get help so they can break that cycle within their family, within their own relationships going forward. And there's myths about, well, it's only in certain kinds of families or certain kinds of households. Anyone can be a survivor of abuse.
And I think one of the things that was important to me as artistic director on this production in particular is the perspective of being a woman in a scenario like this. And so one of the things that I really wanted to do is work with someone, a trusted friend and colleague, who I know would bring a sensitive eye and sensitive ear and sensitive touch to a production that dealt with domestic violence, domestic abuse from a man to a woman, and that was Sasha Gerritsen. And Sasha, how have you thought about the show in relationship to modern sensibilities? Obviously, this place does not take place in 2024, but we're watching it in 2024, and both working with the artist and with the perception of the audience.
Sure, thank you, Kyle. And I just want to say it's an honor for me to be here with all of you, and I'm grateful for your work in our world. Thank you. Thank you. Well, when Kyle and I had conversation about the idea around doing Carousel, there's a little bit of trepidation. Carousel isn't always done as much anymore because of this exact topic. Some people go, nope, not doing that show. Put it on the shelf. We're never touching it again. We had conversation about it, and we realized, gosh, there's some wonderful, wonderful music and dance and acting and everything, and it has hard conversation around it. So we have a choice to make. Do we say, no, we're not having a hard conversation, we're not doing that show, we're not listening to those songs, we're not watching those dances, or do we lean into it and have the conversation? In my opinion, and I feel like it's shared with Kyle and other members of the cast and crew, the only way to affect change sometimes is through hard conversation. So I absolutely looked at it. I looked at the show. I saw what it was. In some ways, if you were to look at what we see on television, as you just mentioned, some of what we see on television is absolutely off the charts, crazy, violent, horrific, terrible. I don't think that this musical is at the same level as some of the shows I watch my 14-year-old watching, and I make him turn it off right away. But it is of a certain genre, and it is of a certain time. And so it was important to us that we have conversations exactly like we're having right now. We were intentional about bringing in all of the extra crew that are now standard, not extra for this show, standard, intimacy choreographer, fight choreographer, all of the other situations where people know that they're safe and that there's a pathway to resolution if there's conflict or if anything that feels uncomfortable. And then being able to make space for the emotions, make space for the conversations. Yes, this is a horrible topic. We had tears in our rehearsals, myself included. There were times when we were dealing with our own life experience, and even though this is a play, but it sometimes does trigger your own life emotions. When I think about what you just said, and I heard something that you just said, and I'm so grateful you said it. My mother, who has passed away now, but she was a therapist and she was an author, and she wrote a book about domestic violence, about childhood abuse that she dealt with, and she always used the word survivors. And I hadn't thought about that for years until you said that. So thank you for bringing my mother into this space with me today. God bless you. Thank you. So I do think that it was really important. And I have to say that I feel like I won the lottery with the cast that we had, because just like our friend here, Malia, who is the most talented human I've ever met in my life, her and her castmates did such a great job and really were willing to be vulnerable. That's the other thing. And then I'll stop because I'm talking too much. But sometimes if we have hard conversations and hard topics and hard themes in plays or musicals or shows or operas, people get scared of leaning into them. And then it's not really authentic and really felt art, because people are always putting up their wall. We have to create a safe space for people to be authentic and to have true emotion expressed on stage in the appropriate way. So anyway, thanks. He'll never let me have the microphone again.
That's fantastic. And I think, speaking on that, Sasha, I think one of the things that is so interesting in the rehearsal room, and again in the audience, having a live audience, is a lot of things like content warnings and such, and the things people bring with them in the room that you just don't know of. We have a cast of, 30 some odd. We have an orchestra of 16, 17, whatever it is, a crew. A lot of those people, we don't know their backstory. We don't know their background. We don't know the hundreds of people in the audience, their backgrounds. And our shows and our audience often reflect a cross-section of experiences, many who have felt unsafe or violent parts of their life. A lot of media is used as a scapegoat for this violence. Press blames society as a whole, video games, whatever you want to do. Has the access to media, like social media, like news at your fingertips, helped or hindered that safety? I'll ask that to Hillary.
Well, I think art and media reflect our culture, and they also shape our culture. So when you are an artist, or when you have a position of influence in the media, I think that you have to know how far your reach can go, and you have to be really careful and intentional about how you use that reach. We know that domestic violence is a learned behavior, and it's shaped by family experiences, it's shaped by the environments that folks are exposed to, but it also can be shaped by the media. And so I think it's really important to use that power really, really carefully and intentionally. And we know that media and art are a powerful tool, and so it really is reflective of the hands that are using that tool. So for example, if someone who wants to cause harm has, the platform, the media, the technology, they are able to use that to hurt survivors, to intimidate, to harass. But also I think art and media can be a really powerful tool to connect survivors, to bring resources and information to folks like you're doing here with the Talkback and with having tabling.
I guess to tag on to that too, some of the conversation we've had around Billy Bigelow is the idea of toxic masculinity, this term that's thrown around quite a bit, and his need to provide, a need to control. How is a modern man? I ask this. I'd like to know. Like, how does a modern man reflected in the media, and how does that reflect in real day in real life?
That's a really interesting topic, right? Because just like women and female identified folks are hurt by gender stereotypes and biases that are influenced by the media and by family, so are male identified folks, right? They grow up getting particular messages about feelings, about the ways that they're supposed to behave that are harmful, and that could put folks, make folks feel like they're in a box, like they can't really express themselves, that, you know, there's certain pathways that they have in life that are different. And so actually at the YWCA, we work with perpetrators of violence as well. And it's really important to ensure that they have access to trauma-informed care too. If you're going to end domestic violence, you can't just serve the survivors. I think you have to work with the folks who are perpetrating. They're hurt people often as well, and they need to learn and to grow with accountability, of course, and there's stuff to say there about Billy's character, I think, but I think with accountability and care and education, then men are able to learn and grow and make different choices.
I like to say it, just my perspective of the show is that, you know, who knows if Billy hadn't killed himself, that Julie would have left him in the end, or, you know, that type of thing too. So speaking of Julie Jordan, Malia, one of the things you're asked to do as an actress is to put yourself, of course, in a very safe environment, hopefully created through this fight choreography and intimacy coordination, but in very sensitive subjects and deal with that. How do you prepare for it, and what's that process look like for you?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's difficult. I think, like, I'd like to think that I'm, you know, the kind of actor that can just shake it off. But you know, my whole body is reacting, and there's like a lot of physical side effects to that. So I think a lot of breath work is important, like before and after I go on stage, and just making sure that I can like reset my nervous system, because unfortunately, being a woman and having a lot of women in my life that I love, these situations are not foreign to me, and so it's really it's a lot, but it's also like, it's nice that we have a really joyful cast, and like I can like walk off stage and laugh with someone directly after. But I think just reminding myself that this is super important, and I always go back to the Kelly O'Hara quote, because she played Julie like maybe about a decade, 15 years ago, and she said that an important part of healing it is actually telling the story. And I just think it's important to remember that we want to center the women of the story as well, and just, you know, how I think it's difficult because I find that a lot of people like run to judge Julie, which is really interesting to me, because it kind of feels like victim blame me. And like, it's really sad. I'll even hear like children, you know, be like, why would you make that decision? And so it's interesting that we live in a world that frames it like that. And I'm always like, well, what about Billy? Why aren't we condemning his actions? And so I think it's interesting to understand why, and to look at and understand why someone chooses to stay in an abusive situation. And I think it's an important reminder of how complicated domestic violence really is, how it's not simple. Leaving someone isn't simple. Loving someone isn't simple. And again, you know, I don't know either exactly what might have happened, because it's also, I think of the cycle of abuse as well, and how, I don't know, I think Julie hopefully works to break it with Louise, although obviously like the generational trauma still kind of gets passed down a little bit, but like I don't know if Billy stayed alive. We don't really know exactly what would have happened, because trauma is really difficult to unlearn, so yeah.
Thank you. Thanks. one of the things you might have heard mention, someone mentioned it is like the show is. I think Sasha actually. The show's dated. Why are you doing that show? And in the same breath, we'll say, "Oh, I'm so glad you're doing Little Shop of Horrors next in the next show," which also has violence in it, and they kill people and chop them up and all kinds of crazy stuff. But because it's through the lens of a comedy, somehow it's more accepted. And I often answer when someone says, "Why are you doing that dated show?" is like, do you say the same thing about Shakespeare, which has so much content that, but because we do musical theater, that it's somehow we can't have those conversations around the art that we create. And I think it's so important because it is the entry level drug per se of performing arts. I think it's so accessible because musicals, people love musicals. They see it as entertainment, but it's also so important to have conversations around what we do as well. Nathan, one of the things that, how do you feel like performing arts, how do you feel performing arts organizations should look at shows like Carousel with its portrayal of violence, of abuse, like Hairspray, which people might not think, oh, it's Hairspray, but there's a huge white savior complex around Hairspray, of course, racism around Hairspray, like Murder in Chicago the musical, everything under the sun in our. How do performing arts organizations continue to do things like that?
I think it's a complex and difficult thing. I do think there is, as Kyle pointed out, a real bias often towards, I think in some ways the reputation that this show has kind of built up over time as we don't want to touch it, it's Carousel, it's dated, it has these issues, has kind of been a self-reinforcing thing because we aren't having some of those same conversations about shows that are in many ways feature a lot of other awful things and a lot of other forms of abuse and violence. So I think, partly it's working with education or literary departments to have things like this, to talk about what's going on stage, that putting something on stage is not an endorsement of the action. For Billy to be an abuser is not us saying this is how a man should act. But without a kind of proper framing, that can be something that gets lost. So having a kind of, having Sasha's director's note in the program, providing, things on the website, having supplemental materials can sort of help frame why a show that might be seen as difficult or dated is still worth doing. Because in many ways, the structure that Rodgers and Hammerstein kind of created with their shows is something we're still living with in musical theater. There's been deviation from it, but also there hasn't. So I think there's a real need to say, why are we doing this show? What is it missing? How can we approach it with the most care and intentionality possible, so that we are creating something that is true and not one-dimensional. And Shakespeare's easy in a sense. You can rewrite things. Some of the Hammerstein musicals are also about to be public domain, and I would love to do some rewrites on this one, but.
So just so everyone knows, as a musical theater company, all of our shows are leased through a rights company. So we pay a percentage of the ticket sales go directly to the royalties. So the companies own the rights. We pay the royalties based on how many tickets we sell, as well as another chunk of change to do the show. So and part of that is that we cannot change a single note, a single word from the show. So there are restrictions on how we should do certain things. Now, shows are being rewritten all the time. If you've seen Anything Goes in the last couple years, there was a racist trope in the show with 2 Asian characters that has been rewritten now. You cannot do the original version of the show. So it's very, very interesting to see that happen. I guess I'd like to open up to everyone on the panel. Like, how do you see going forward? If we were to remove all of this from our, let's just say, domestic abuse from our art, what does that look like? Is it good? Is it bad? To remove these things, to change them. There's an operetta called The Mikado that no one does anymore because of the very very racist language in it. How do we move forward with some of these movies? I just watched. The Mel Brooks movie, Blazing Saddles, and there was a whole thing at the beginning, kind of putting in context. Well, how do we move forward? Like, how does anyone else see that? I'd be interested to hear from anyone. Anyone?
Well, I'm going to say what you said, which is that I think these are wonderful opportunities for discussion. I think what you're doing right now is exactly what we can do with a piece of art. The arts can be our partners in getting these discussions going, putting that information out on the website, just like you said, the notes in the program. I don't know if you do things with schools in the community, over the language, talking about the language of the show, talking about the themes in the show. Use it for good instead of, I mean, it's there. There's wonderful things about the show, and it's also an opportunity to teach.
I absolutely agree, but I would really like to echo what our Julie said tonight. I think that it's really important that survivor stories are told, and these can be opportunities for, if the survivor chooses, of course, because it's up to them always. It's an opportunity for them to heal and to grow and to invite us into that healing as well. And so I think that's number one and should be the first thing we think about.
I'm going to respond and then I'm going to run just because I don't have much time before the next show. Yes, I just wanted to also say, I think it's so important to tell these stories. I think Carousel was so progressive for the time in that, like my friend Evelyn, who was here today, said that it showcases a marriage that doesn't end happy, and it kind of reminds us of the ways that relationships can perpetuate abuse and cycles of abuse because generational trauma is passed down through our domestic lives. And like you were saying, I think the rewrites will be really important. I still struggle with the last line that I have to say in the show about, somehow someone hitting you and not having it hurt. I've tried to justify it every which way, and I can't. So I think hopefully moving forward, that's something that'll be reconsidered, because truly I feel like the rest of the show, as long as it's reframed in a thoughtful way, is salvageable. And I think just in the media in general and portrayals of violence and domestic abuse, it really comes down to the framing of it and making sure we're centering the right people, because unfortunately I think, for lack of a better word, trauma porn, I think, is really common in the media. This is off the top of my head, but Game of Thrones comes to mind. It's so violent, unnecessarily violent towards women. And I think it's because people kind of get off on it a little, which is really gross. And so I think it's important to, not make it like a spectacle, to not glorify it, and I think, again, that just comes to centering, the survivor. But yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, Malia. Great, we just have a few more moments, but I'd love to open it up if anyone has a question from the group. Yes, all the way in the back, way in the back.
I'm going to question the fact that when he dies and he goes to heaven, it seemed like he was forgiven.
Great.
Because
Okay.
they allowed him to come back, and then he goes and he pushes his daughter. Did the same thing. So what was that all about?
Yeah. Did you hear that?
I know. It's crazy. I think I also do opera directing, and I've made the joke that if this had been an opera, after You Never Walked Alone and he was dead on the floor, the curtain would have come down and it would have been done. That would have been the end of the opera, right? But I think because of the time that this was written in and the fact that it was a musical, and typically, especially of this time, not today, but especially of this time, you couldn't have an opera, a musical that ended that way. You had to figure it out and have a happy ending and everybody leaves happy or something. They wanted to try to give him a path to redemption is how I see it. So they brought down the angels and they brought him up to heaven and they allowed him the opportunity to try to go down and help his daughter. And that was the one thing that I did and I was hoping that nobody from New York was here to like haul me off. I made them all female presenting people in heaven. It was my choice. There was no, that was not in the script. They were originally male presenting, and I made them female. I was like, Kyle, are we going to get in trouble and get closed down? We decided it was okay. Anyway, but and I was like, oh, you're gonna go up to heaven, and everyone's gonna be a woman. Ha 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 ha. So but then those patterns of abuse, and of course, there's a lot of things we could say about it. For him, it was 5 minutes. But then the angel said, well, you have to get used to a new way of telling time. It's been 15 years. But for Billy, his pattern, which he lived in up until 5 minutes ago when he died, he was still clearly in. So he was frustrated and he hit her, right? And that they kept trying to give him the path to redemption. They kept trying to give it to him, kept trying to give him more times. One of the conversations that I had with actors made a really good point to me. This musical is often given such a bad rap about this conversation, and a lot of people in the media don't like it, and they say it, and we shouldn't do it, etc. I don't ever hear people say, oh, and by the way, let's talk about suicide. Oh, and by the way, let's talk about the fact that he committed suicide instead of going to jail because our justice prison systems are so difficult that he would rather die instead of go to jail. And I was like, whoa, like I had never seen the show before, of course, because those are important topics also to deal with, but they're not the ones that come to mind when you hear this show, but they are very present. We see his suicide on stage. We verbally hear the report of the hit, and I was like, I am horrified that as a director, I hadn't really considered that aspect before we had this conversation. So to answer your question in a roundabout way, I do believe they tried really hard to tag on this ending to give him a path to redemption so that we could sort of end happy. It sort of is a happy, sad ending. We're trying to build community in that she's there and that they're all there and everyone's around her and you'll never walk alone. But it's happy with tears in your eyes. But I think that and it's the same song, ironically, right? So I think they were really trying to make it work in the time frame, in the era that it was written, where the tradition was to not have a sad ending.
I will also just tag on to that for a little, just a few thoughts. Rodgers and Hammerstein themselves dealt with, not to step on the dramaturg's toes, but dealt with serious subjects in every one of their musicals. Laurie in Oklahoma, the first feminist really musical theater icon of choosing a man, of having her own sexual awakening. Things like South Pacific with racism, with Sound of Music with Nazi and anti-Semitism. Like every one of their shows dealt with something of its time period. And I think I'd like to open it up to the panel too of what are we dealing with at this time as a culture in 2024? What is at the what's on the forefront of our mind? What is it? Anyone? There's many things.
I guess I would briefly say that we're dealing with the same issues in all of those Rodgers and Hammerstein musicals. I just think, racism, homophobia, transphobia, sexism, violence, those have been issues, they're still issues. I don't think we should pretend we've solved those issues. I'm not saying we haven't made some progress, but they're very much still present today, I think.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yes, right here.
I don't know if anybody else had this reading of it, but it feels like there's an aspect of Billy's work as a barker that's sex work, in that he's using the whole thing Billy's known for flirting with women, and there's the way that he has interaction with his wife versus the closeness that he has with his bad guy, ex-con best friend. I'm not trying to say this in a way of excusing the actions of him as a perpetrator, but there definitely does feel like there can be kind of he's someone who's very hyper masculinity, but also there's potential you're reading this character. I don't know if anybody has any thoughts on that or.
Nathan, what's your background? What are you studying?
So I'm a PhD candidate at Northwestern in the Theater and Performance Studies department, and I write about gender and sexuality in musical theater. So, hello. I think that's something important about so much of what I think is really important about Rodgers and Hammerstein and their canon is that, there's debates about this, but I think generally the consensus is that that was sort of the birth of what we now think of as the musical, right? We have songs wedded to a theatrical play structure, which we call the book, and they created characters that really were complex. And I feel like you don't get a lot of just two-dimensionality on stage. I think Billy is really interesting because he is clearly hemmed in by this idea that he has to be a certain kind of man. And he's struck by the fact that he is clearly poor and can't provide for his family. And I think with what Malia said so sort of beautifully is and in thinking about the portrayal of abuse on stage, he's not an irredeemably bad person necessarily. There clearly is some sort of love there. He also doesn't know how to do that correctly and ends up hurting people. I think it shows that forms of real care and love can be also very close to instances of violence, and people can really hurt those that they care about. So I think we get a lot of just we get a lot of little elements of what could have made Billy be the way he is. Ultimately, he's responsible for his own actions and doesn't, I think, properly atone for them. I kept thinking, there's so many instances where I'm if you just said, "I'm sorry, Julie," it'd be a different play. But he never says, "I'm sorry." All he can say to her is, "I love you. I loved you." And I think what if there had been a real apology and some attempt at restitution? It's not something that we get in this play. But I think it lets us see I think that's part of his idea and vision of who he is as a working class man in this kind of time and era is that's not something that's on his radar. He doesn't have a good feminist understanding of restorative justice.
Great. There's one more in the far back, I think, and then one up here with the mask. In the far back. Yes, that's you.
If you change the whole story and make Billy a nicer guy, then it's not the story.
Of course, and that's why I think we continue to do things like this, is because the reality is it creates drama, right? So you feel terrible for Julie. You feel terrible for him. You might hate him in the end, and that's okay. That's what art's supposed to do. It's supposed to create this conversation. It's supposed to make you feel. And I think it's supposed to create conversation. And I think, and that's why we're doing things like this. That's why we're partnering with people like the YWCA, with Shalva. We're working with Kurt's Cafe later in next season, and really working to create that conversation so that we can make change, and that we can continue to tell these stories, because we all have a value to each other, and that's why we're doing this. So, yes. Anyone else? Great. Oh, I think it's all good. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone on our panel. Thank you, everyone, for sticking around. Thank you so much for coming to see musical theater, and have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.